As the plane prepared for takeoff from Los Angeles to New York, the atmosphere in the cabin was filled with the familiar hum of activity. Passengers settled into their seats, adjusting carry-ons and chatting softly among themselves. The sounds of laughter, the clatter of luggage, and the soft murmur of conversations blended together, creating a peaceful, almost routine environment. But amidst this casual bustle, a young man entered the plane, his presence striking yet unassuming. He was Barron Trump, a figure known by many but understood by few. At 18, he already bore the weight of being the son of a former U.S. president, a title that commanded attention wherever he went. However, Barron had always chosen a life of solitude, preferring to observe rather than participate in the noisy spotlight that often engulfed his family. As he walked toward his first-class seat, there was no showmanship, no grand gestures, just a quiet confidence. Barron was the kind of person who, despite his family's prominence, seemed to escape the glare of attention, blending into the crowd without a second thought. He sat down, opened a hardcover book, and allowed himself to drift into its pages, a small island of calm amid the flurry of the airport's energy. For Barron, this moment was just another step in a life of privacy and quiet introspection. But little did he know, this ordinary flight was about to become a defining moment for him, a moment that would test not just his character, but also his understanding of the values that had been passed down through his family. In the quiet of his first-class seat, Barron was about to make a choice that would ripple far beyond his own world. As Barron Trump settled into his first-class seat, immersed in the quiet comfort of his book, the usual buzz of the plane's cabin began to fade into the background. But then, the steady hum of the flight attendants and the soft shuffle of footsteps were interrupted by something else, an elderly man slowly boarding the plane. His movements were deliberate, his gait unsteady, a reflection of years spent in a life of hardship. The man wore a faded military jacket, its once vibrant patches and medals barely clinging to the fabric, signs of a life that had been anything but easy. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, not just from age but from a lifetime of struggles. There was a visible weariness in his steps, a quiet testimony to the burdens he had carried, burdens of sacrifice, of service, and of survival. Yet, despite the weight of his years, the man's presence carried a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Barron, noticing the elderly man's careful steps, couldn't help but observe a particular detail others might have missed, a deep scar running along the man's right wrist. It wasn't just any scar, it was the kind of scar that told a story, one filled with pain, survival, and sacrifice. Barron had heard countless stories about veterans, men who had given their youth to serve their country, only to return to a world that seemed to have forgotten them. But in that moment, as he watched this man slowly make his way to the back of the plane, something about the veteran's quiet resilience caught Barron's attention. The veteran was a man who had clearly lived through unimaginable hardships, yet he carried himself with a stoic grace, as if the struggles of his past had never fully broken him. As the elderly man reached the rear of the plane, his ticket was checked, and the tension in the air grew palpable. A flight attendant hesitated, her expression shifting from professional to uncomfortable as she checked the list and then looked up at the man. "I'm very sorry, but your name isn't showing up in our system," she said with uncertainty. The old man's face fell, and the heavy silence that followed was filled with the awkward tension of a situation no one seemed prepared to address. It was a scenario that, unfortunately, many veterans knew all too well, being overlooked, dismissed, or treated like an inconvenience. The flight attendant's uncertainty turned into an apologetic offer to help, but the man's shoulders slumped as he took out his ticket, his voice hoarse from fatigue as he explained that it had been purchased weeks ago. As murmurs spread through the cabin, the situation seemed to reach an impasse. A businessman nearby casually shrugged, dismissing the veteran's plight as just another clerical error. Passengers exchanged glances, some frowning in mild annoyance, others choosing to ignore the situation altogether. But then, just as the elderly veteran began to step back in resignation, something extraordinary happened. Barron Trump, sitting in the comfort of his first-class seat, stood up. The entire cabin fell into silence as all eyes turned toward him. "He can have my seat," Barron's steady voice cut through the quiet like a ripple in still water. His decision was firm, unhesitating, and it was made not out of obligation but from a deep sense of empathy and respect. For a moment, the cabin was suspended in time. The veteran, confused and stunned, blinked, unable to comprehend the offer. A first-class seat, the luxury and privilege it afforded, was something not easily given up, especially not by someone in Barron's position. Yet, Barron's gaze remained calm and unwavering, his body language exuding a quiet confidence that made it clear he had no second thoughts. "He needs it more than I do," Barron added, his voice carrying a weight of sincerity that softened the tension in the air. The flight attendants, though clearly taken aback by the offer, quickly recognized Barron's genuine kindness. There was a brief exchange of looks between the attendants, and after a moment of hesitation, they nodded in agreement. Barron's act of kindness was more than just a gesture, it was a moment that revealed the depth of his character. Despite the privileged life he led, Barron had chosen not to cling to the comfort and luxury afforded by his first-class seat. Instead, he made a decision that would not only change the course of the veteran's journey but would also impact everyone who witnessed it. In a world that often seems to prioritize status, wealth, and entitlement, Barron's quiet compassion was a reminder that true kindness transcends all boundaries. It was a moment that proved that sometimes, the most powerful acts of kindness are the simplest ones. As Barron Trump stepped aside, the entire cabin fell into an almost eerie silence. The young man, who could have easily chosen to remain in the comfort of his first-class seat, had instead made a choice that would forever change the atmosphere of the flight. His decision to give up his seat to the elderly veteran wasn't just an act of generosity, it was a display of humility, a silent rebellion against the materialism that often defines the world of privilege he inhabited. As he moved toward the cramped space of economy class, his face remained calm, almost unaffected by the gravity of the moment. Yet inside, Barron could feel something stirring. The quiet whispers of the passengers, the stares that followed him, and the unspoken shift in the cabin created a profound sense of connection in the air. In the economy section, the elderly veteran, who had stood frozen, unsure whether to accept the generous offer, finally took a tentative step forward. His movements were slow, deliberate, and filled with hesitation, as though he couldn't believe that such kindness was truly being extended to him. He was a man who had seen the darkest parts of life, his eyes, etched with the years of battle and the scars of neglect, carried the weight of memories that few could truly comprehend. For him, this simple gesture was more than just a seat swap, it was a reminder that, despite the way the world had treated him, there were still people who saw him, who acknowledged his existence, and who respected the sacrifices he had made for his country. The flight attendant, who had witnessed countless high-profile passengers, stood in stunned silence as the veteran slowly made his way to the now vacant first-class seat. She had served celebrities, politicians, and wealthy businessmen, but never had she seen someone like Barron Trump, a young man who had everything but chose, without hesitation, to give it all up for someone who had nothing. As the veteran settled into the plush comfort of the first-class seat, a wave of gratitude washed over him, though he remained silent, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. The years of hardship, the battles fought not only on foreign soil but in the streets of his own country, seemed to fade just a little as he sank into the seat. For a brief moment, he was no longer the forgotten soldier, he was simply a man who had been offered a rare and precious gift, dignity. Meanwhile, Barron, who had just moments before been seated in the lap of luxury, now found himself wedged into a much smaller seat in the back of the plane. As he glanced around, he saw the curious stares of passengers, some clearly puzzled by his decision, others whispering amongst themselves. A businessman nearby couldn't hide his surprise. "You just gave up one of the best seats on the plane for this?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Barron, with a soft smile, simply nodded, reopening his book as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. The businessman, like many others on the plane, failed to understand the profound nature of Barron's decision. To them, it was just a seat. But for Barron, it was far more than that, it was an opportunity to make a choice, to stand for something beyond the superficial privileges that often define his life. As the plane continued its journey, the quiet reverence that had filled the cabin began to shift. Passengers who had initially viewed the veteran's presence with indifference or even annoyance now sat a little straighter, their hearts subtly changed by Barron's act of compassion. A few minutes later, another flight attendant, her expression more thoughtful than before, walked toward the first-class section. She approached the veteran cautiously, holding a slight tremor in her voice. "Sir, I need to verify something with you," she said, her eyes scanning the manifest once more. "There's no record of your ticket. Could you provide another form of identification?" The veteran, who had spent decades in the shadows, simply nodded. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a tattered military ID, his fingers trembling slightly as he handed it to the attendant. As she examined the faded card, her face slowly transformed. "You're a Vietnam War veteran?" she asked, her voice shaking with recognition. The veteran nodded silently, and in that instant, the entire cabin seemed to pause. The veteran's identity was no longer just that of an old man struggling to find his place on a plane, it was a reminder of the deep and painful history that so many had forgotten. He was not just a soldier, he was a man who had lived through hell, only to return home to a country that turned its back on him. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted again. Passengers, who had once looked past the veteran, now saw him. They saw the pain in his eyes, the stories etched into every wrinkle on his face. And they saw Barron Trump, a young man who had given up everything for a moment of dignity and respect. It wasn't just about a seat on a plane, it was about something deeper, something far more profound. Barron had unknowingly sparked a conversation that went far beyond the flight, a conversation that touched on history, on sacrifice, and on the simple power of kindness. As the flight continued, the passengers on board were still processing the moment that had unfolded before them. The cabin had shifted, both in atmosphere and in energy. What had started as a routine flight was now marked by a profound moment of humanity, Barron Trump's selfless act of kindness. The silence that had followed Barron's offer to give up his seat for the elderly veteran lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the weight such small gestures can carry. What had seemed like an insignificant exchange of seats now had a ripple effect far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The veteran, who had been struggling with a lifetime of being overlooked and dismissed, had been given a rare opportunity to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected. But there was more to this moment than just the comfort of a first-class seat. The veteran, whose eyes had carried the sadness of forgotten sacrifices, now sat in the very seat that so many would envy. Yet, despite the physical comfort of the seat, the emotional weight he carried was heavier than any luxury could alleviate. He had spent years, decades even, trying to bury the ghosts of the past, trying to forget the way his country had treated him after his return from the Vietnam War. In those moments of hardship, when no one would hire him, when he was left to sleep on park benches and in dark alleyways, he had wondered if he would ever be seen again. But now, for the first time in many years, he was not only seen, he was acknowledged. It wasn't just the seat or the flight that had changed in that moment. It was the veteran's perception of the world around him, his belief that maybe, just maybe, there were still people who cared, who would offer their hands without hesitation. Barron Trump, despite his wealth and status, had done something rare. He had chosen to look beyond the privileges of his upbringing and recognize the worth of a person who had been lost in the shadows of society. It was a moment of profound empathy, a decision that did not stem from a place of obligation, but from a place of understanding, a quiet, deep-rooted respect for the sacrifice of others. As Barron settled into the cramped seat in the back of the plane, his mind began to shift, too. The simple act of giving up a first-class seat had awakened something in him, an understanding of the power of kindness, of empathy, of connection. It wasn't about the seat. It wasn't about the luxury or the status. It was about making someone feel seen. As the airplane began to make its final preparations for takeoff, the unexpected story that had unfolded in the cabin took an even more powerful turn. The elderly Vietnam War veteran, who had initially been dismissed and overlooked, was now seated in first class, his hand still gripping the armrests of the plush seat, as if trying to convince himself that this moment was real. His eyes, weathered from years of hardship, were filled with a mixture of disbelief and profound gratitude. The cabin had fallen into a strange quietness after Barron Trump's act of kindness, a moment of deep reflection that seemed to have transcended the ordinary hum of the flight. Passengers, who had earlier been preoccupied with their own routines, now sat with a heightened awareness, each person processing what had just unfolded in their own way. In first class, the veteran's gaze was distant, and he appeared lost in thought, no longer concerned with the discomforts of the flight or the strange look that passengers had cast in his direction earlier. Instead, he seemed to be tracing the years that had brought him here, to this moment, and this seat. For so many years, he had been ignored, misunderstood, and made to feel like an inconvenience, just another forgotten soldier. His time in Vietnam had been brutal, his return to the US even more so, as he faced the harsh realities of a country that did not welcome him back. He had been spat on, ridiculed, and treated like a criminal. The scars from those years were not just on his body, they were etched into his soul, a painful reminder of the cost of his service and sacrifice. Yet, here he was, sitting in the seat of luxury that Barron Trump had willingly given up. This act of compassion was a momentary escape from a past filled with pain and rejection. For the first time in many years, the veteran felt seen. In the economy section, Barron Trump, who had quietly given up the privilege of first class, now found himself surrounded by a different reality. The tight, uncomfortable rows of seats were a stark contrast to the expansive comfort he had just vacated. The air was thicker with chatter, the noise of everyday passengers lost in their own worlds, going about their business. Some passengers glanced at Barron, perhaps surprised by his willingness to trade a first-class experience for the cramped conditions of economy. Yet Barron, ever the quiet observer, said nothing. He opened his book again, lost in the words on the page, his face betraying no sign of regret or discomfort. What had happened just moments ago had been an instinctive decision, a choice made without hesitation or thought for the consequences. He didn't need to justify it, nor did he expect applause. The act of kindness had been enough. And for Barron, that was all that mattered. But as the flight continued, something profound began to stir in the cabin. The quiet reverence that had followed Barron's selfless gesture grew into something deeper as the passengers processed the impact of what they had witnessed. It wasn't just about a young man giving up a seat, it was about something larger, something that transcended the material world they inhabited. Barron's act had sparked a moment of reflection in each person who had witnessed it, forcing them to confront their own values, their own priorities, and their own understanding of what truly matters. This wasn't a simple flight anymore, it had become a journey into something far more meaningful. As the veteran in first class continued to sit in the comfort Barron had provided, his thoughts turned back to the days long past, when he had first returned from Vietnam, broken and alone. The story he had been holding on to for decades, the story of how Fred Trump had helped him when no one else would, began to emerge in his mind. The veteran had been homeless, living on the streets of New York, with no job, no family, and no future. He had been ignored by society, looked down upon by those who should have been grateful for his service. Yet, when he had been at his lowest, when he had lost all hope, a stranger had extended a hand to him. That stranger was Fred Trump, the grandfather of Barron, and it was this simple act. As the flight progressed, the mood in the cabin had undeniably shifted. What had once been a simple, routine journey now felt like a sacred space where humanity, kindness, and the echoes of history intertwined. The act of Barron Trump giving up his first-class seat had sparked something far deeper than anyone could have predicted. It wasn't just about the luxury seat that had changed hands, it was about the way Barron's simple gesture had reverberated through the passengers around him, awakening a sense of empathy and connection that many had long forgotten. Sitting in economy, Barron felt the weight of the moment in a way he hadn't anticipated. Surrounded by the hustle and bustle of everyday life, it was easy to forget how impactful an act of kindness could be. Yet, as the veteran settled into the first-class seat, Barron could sense the ripple effect of his decision. The economy section, which had once felt so cramped and distant from the world of first class, now seemed a place of deeper meaning. He was no longer just a young man in the back of the plane, he was now part of something much bigger. His simple act of giving had opened the door to a story that had remained silent for decades, and he, unknowingly, had become a bridge between past and present. The veteran, now seated in comfort, began to reflect on the moment as well. His hands, once trembling from the cold and hunger of years spent homeless, now rested on the armrests of a first-class seat. His eyes, which had witnessed the worst humanity could offer, now softened with gratitude. For so long, he had been invisible, another casualty of war who had come home to a country that didn't seem to care. Yet, here he was, in a seat of privilege, a place where he could almost feel the weight of the years lifting off his shoulders. The recognition he felt was overwhelming, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel something he thought he'd lost: hope. Meanwhile, the flight attendants, who had seen their fair share of high-profile passengers and celebrities, were beginning to process the profound nature of Barron's gesture. They had been trained to handle every situation with professionalism and grace, but there was something undeniably different about this moment. It wasn't just another celebrity doing something for the cameras, it was a real, raw act of humanity that transcended wealth, status, and expectation. The young man who had the world at his feet had chosen, without hesitation, to give up his seat to a man who had once fought for that very country, only to return and be forgotten. The kindness that had been extended was so much more. As the plane hummed steadily through the sky, the true power of the moment Barron Trump had unwittingly created began to settle deeply into the passengers' minds. The atmosphere had shifted drastically since Barron's simple but profound decision to give up his seat for the elderly Vietnam War veteran. What had seemed like an isolated act of kindness had, in fact, sparked a deeper reflection within everyone who had witnessed it. As the veteran, who had once been invisible to the world, now sat comfortably in first class, he was no longer just a forgotten soldier, he was a man with a story, one that needed to be heard. And in that moment, his voice, though weathered by years of silence and neglect, began to resonate across the cabin. The passengers, who had once sat idly in their seats, now leaned in, captivated by the unfolding narrative. There was something in the veteran's voice, something raw and honest, that tugged at their hearts and forced them to confront uncomfortable truths. As he spoke of his experience in Vietnam, the horrors he had faced, and the cruel welcome he had received upon returning home, the plane felt smaller, more intimate, like a gathering of people who had momentarily forgotten their differences and were united by a shared sense of humanity. But the veteran's story was more than just an account of battlefields and pain, it was a story of survival, of resilience, and of redemption. For decades, the veteran had been carrying the burden of his past, a past that had been weighed down by the rejection and misunderstanding of those he had fought for. He had returned from war to a world that had turned its back on him. He had been spat on, called names, and made to feel as though his sacrifice had been in vain. Yet, despite the pain, despite the years of isolation, the veteran had never lost his strength. He had pushed through, finding ways to survive, even when it felt like the world had forgotten about him. And then, one day, when he had hit rock bottom, when the weight of his struggles seemed unbearable, someone had reached out. That someone was Fred Trump, the grandfather of Barron. The veteran spoke slowly, almost reverently, as he recalled how Fred Trump had found him on the streets of New York, at his lowest point. Fred hadn't looked at him with pity, nor had he dismissed him as so many others had. Instead, he had seen the man beneath the hardened exterior, the man who had fought for his country, and he had extended a hand. Fred Trump offered him a job, a place to stay, and most importantly, a chance to begin again. The veteran had never forgotten that act of kindness. It had been the turning point in his life, the moment that had shown him that there were still people in the world who cared. As he finished telling his story, the cabin was filled with a heavy silence. It was as if time had slowed down, and every passenger on board was reflecting on what they had just heard. Some passengers looked down, wiping away tears that had formed unexpectedly. Others sat up straighter, their faces marked with expressions of understanding and admiration. They had heard stories about the mistreatment of Vietnam veterans, but hearing it firsthand, seeing the pain and sorrow in the veterans' eyes, made it all too real. The flight attendants, who had witnessed countless high-profile passengers, now stood still, visibly affected by the veterans' words. They were no longer just serving drinks, they were participants in a moment of human connection, a moment that transcended the boundaries of their roles as employees. Barron Trump, still seated in the back of the plane, sat in a quiet stillness. He had been a part of this moment in ways that he hadn't fully realized. He had been the catalyst, the one whose decision to give up his seat had unknowingly unlocked a chapter in his grandfather's history, a chapter that had remained hidden for decades. Barron's simple act of kindness had allowed the veteran to share his story with the world. But Barron didn't feel the need for recognition. To him, it had been a decision made out of instinct, an act that felt right in the moment. He had no idea how deeply it would impact those around him, or how it would forever alter the perception of the people who had witnessed it. Yet, as the flight continued, Barron began to understand something profoundly significant. He realized that his grandfather's legacy was not just built on wealth, fame, or influence, it was built on compassion, kindness, and the belief that everyone deserved a second chance. Fred Trump had given the veteran a chance, and now, in an unexpected twist of fate, Barron had done the same. The legacy of kindness had come full circle, and Barron had unknowingly become a living part of it. The plane continued its journey, but the mood in the cabin had shifted. It was no longer just a flight from one place to. As the plane began its descent, signaling the end of the long journey from Los Angeles to New York, something remarkable lingered in the air. It wasn't the familiar sense of routine that usually fills the cabin during the final moments of a flight. This time, the atmosphere had been transformed, charged with emotion, with connection, and with the weight of a story that had unfolded in the span of just a few hours. For the passengers on board, what had started as a typical flight had become a deeply personal experience, a reminder of the power of kindness and the ripple effects that can occur from a single, selfless act. Barron Trump, still seated in the back of the plane, was lost in thought. His once quiet demeanor had shifted, and there was a sense of quiet reflection in the way he sat, watching the world around him. He hadn't expected his simple decision to give up a first-class seat to have such a profound impact, both on the veteran and on the passengers who had witnessed it. Yet, as the plane's engines hummed in preparation for landing, Barron realized something profound. In giving up that seat, he had not only altered the course of the veteran's journey but had also sparked a series of events that no one could have predicted. The story that had unfolded on the plane had not just been about a young man offering his seat to an elderly veteran. It had become a journey through time, a journey that had brought to the forefront the powerful legacy of compassion that had been passed down through generations. The veteran, who had once been forgotten by society, had now been given the opportunity to share his story, to be seen and acknowledged by those around him. And Barron, who had grown up surrounded by wealth and privilege, had been given a lesson in humility, in understanding, and in the power of human connection. As the veteran sat in the first-class seat, his gaze slowly moved across the cabin, his heart full of a complex mix of emotions. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in decades: gratitude. He had spent so much of his life being overlooked, his sacrifices minimized, and his presence ignored. But in that moment, he was being treated with dignity, something he thought he had lost forever. The small act of kindness from Barron Trump had given him a chance to reclaim that part of himself, to remember that his life, his story, still mattered. It wasn't just the seat that had changed hands, it was the very perception of the veteran's worth that had been altered. As he sat in the lap of luxury, he couldn't help but reflect on the years of hardship he had endured. There had been times when he had wondered if anyone would ever acknowledge his struggles, if anyone would care about the scars he carried from the war. But Barron's act of generosity had given him more than just comfort, it had given him the gift of recognition. In that first-class seat, the veteran didn't just see the plush leather and the extra legroom, he saw the respect and humanity that had been afforded to him. Meanwhile, as the flight attendants made their rounds through the cabin, the magnitude of Barron's gesture began to settle in. They had been on countless flights before, serving politicians, celebrities, and businessmen who came and went with little more than a wave or a smile. But Barron Trump was different. His decision wasn't made for the sake of publicity or recognition. It wasn't a photo op or a headline-grabbing stunt. It was a genuine, quiet act of kindness that had reverberated throughout the entire flight. The flight attendants, who had been trained to remain professional in all situations, found themselves caught up in the weight of the moment. They had witnessed kindness before, but never quite like this. Barron had done something few would ever think to do, especially given his position in society. He had stepped down from the comfort of his high-status life to offer a man in need a place of dignity, a simple, but profound, exchange. As the veteran shared his story with the flight attendants, passengers gathered around, drawn to the narrative that was unfolding. The man who had been dismissed, ignored, and forgotten for so long was now being heard, and his words resonated deeply with those who listened. His account of the Vietnam War, of his return to a country that had turned its back on him, filled the cabin with a sense of collective reflection. The pain in his voice, the sorrow in his eyes, was palpable. He spoke of the deep scars that war had left on him, not just physical wounds, but emotional and psychological scars that had never healed. He shared the loneliness he had endured in the years that followed, when he had wandered the streets of New York, trying to survive while society looked the other way. And he spoke of Fred Trump, Barron's grandfather, who had reached out to him when no one else would. The veteran's words were not just a recounting of the past, they were a call to recognize the sacrifice of those who had served, to acknowledge the humanity of those who had been cast aside. And as the veteran spoke of Fred Trump's kindness, the cabin fell into a heavy silence. The realization began to sink in that Barron's grandfather had been the one to give this man a second chance when no one else had. Fred Trump had seen the veteran for who he truly was, not as a broken, forgotten man, but as someone worthy of respect and opportunity. He had given him a job, a place to stay, and a chance to rebuild his life. And now, Barron had unknowingly continued that legacy. As the plane descended into New York, the passengers sat in quiet contemplation, their hearts and minds full of the lessons they had learned during the flight. Barron Trump, a young man born into wealth and privilege, had shown them that kindness doesn't come from a place of obligation, it comes from a place of understanding, of seeing others as human beings with stories, struggles, and worth. The simple act of giving up a seat had sparked a ripple effect that had touched every passenger on that flight, and they would carry that lesson with them long after they had left the plane. For Barron, the journey had only just begun. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to gather their belongings, he found himself reflecting on everything that had transpired. He had unknowingly become part of a story that had been written long before he had even stepped onto the plane, a story of sacrifice, resilience, and the power of human connection. And in that moment, Barron realized that the greatest lessons in life often come not from textbooks or lectures, but from the simple, quiet moments when we choose to extend kindness to others. He had become part of something much bigger than himself, and he would carry that realization with him for the rest of his life. As the flight attendants made their final preparations, Barron received a message from his mother. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you," it read. And in that moment, Barron understood exactly why. The story of Barron Trump giving up his first-class seat to a Vietnam War veteran serves as a powerful reminder that acts of kindness, no matter how small, can have a profound impact on the lives of others. In today's fast-paced world, where success and status often dominate the conversation, it's easy to overlook the humanity of those around us. However, moments like these highlight the importance of empathy, understanding, and selflessness. Barron's decision wasn't driven by a desire for recognition, it was simply a choice to treat another person with dignity, something that can often be forgotten when people are caught up in their own lives. In American culture, where individualism and ambition are often celebrated, this story reminds us that true strength lies not in what we can accumulate for ourselves, but in how we lift others up. The veteran's story of hardship and sacrifice, coupled with Barron's act of kindness, shows that sometimes the simplest gestures can reconnect us to our shared humanity. Whether it's offering a helping hand, showing respect to someone who's been overlooked, or simply listening to someone's story, these actions not only transform others' lives but also enrich our own.